Story 1. The journey had been proceeding smoothly until an unexpected sign appeared. I had been traveling on this particular stretch of highway in Alaska for an extended period, with only myself, my vehicle, and an endless expanse of snow in sight. The distant mountains were so faint they seemed like smudges against the sky. I hadn't encountered another car for nearly 90 minutes, and my fuel gauge was approaching the quarter tank mark. In this isolated region, such a detail immediately commands attention, prompting mental calculations of remaining mileage and the true meaning of a quarter tank in frigid temperatures. Then, as if specifically waiting for me, a weather-beaten wooden sign materialized at the roadside. I almost missed it. The paint was largely gone, yet the letters were still discernible enough to read, "Service Station, 1 mile." I instinctively reduced my speed. It made no logical sense. I had thoroughly reviewed my map twice before departing. There was supposed to be nothing here. No settlements, no secondary roads, no small outposts where someone might be barely surviving by selling provisions and fuel to hunters. Just the highway, and that was all. The sign looked ancient, with sun-cracked wood and peeling strips of paint. However, if accurate, it could prevent me from depleting my fuel in the middle of nowhere. The alternative was to risk hoping I would find something further down the road before my luck ran out. The turnoff appeared quickly, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt disappearing between towering spruce trees. Without prior knowledge, it would be easily missed. The snow was not deep, only thin patches that crunched freshly under the tires. I cautiously drove down the lane at approximately 30 miles per hour, winding through the trees. After barely 3 minutes, the road opened into a clearing, and there it was, a small single-story fueling station with an overhanging roof and a lone pump out front. It was the color of damp cardboard, with long strips of paint peeling vertically down the walls. The pump itself looked like a museum exhibit, with rust along its edges and faded but visible numbers on its dials. No lights were on inside, and there was no sign of activity. I parked beside the pump and exited the vehicle. The air here felt heavier, quieter. Not merely quiet in the absence of traffic, but an unnerving quiet that made my own footsteps sound incorrect. I called out toward the glass door. My voice did not echo. No response came. The door was unlocked, so I stepped inside. It was definitely colder inside than out, which defied logic. I could see my breath in small white puffs. At the rear, a counter was coated with a faint layer of frost, as if undisturbed for years. The shelves were fully stocked, but the items looked ancient. Chips in packaging I hadn't seen since childhood, soda bottles with cloudy liquid and labels so yellowed they were almost brown. It was like stepping into a time capsule that had been left unsealed. I tapped my knuckles on the counter, calling out, "Hello?" A sound came from the back, a door closing. Then footsteps, slow, steady, with precise, even spacing between each step as if being counted. A man emerged from the shadows. He had a thin face and skin so pale it possessed the bluish tint sometimes seen in individuals who have spent an entire winter indoors. He was dressed neatly, flannel shirt, pressed jeans, but it wasn't a contemporary neatness. It appeared as though he had dressed for a photograph from the late 90s. He wore no hat or gloves, yet showed no signs of cold. "You need gas?" he asked, his voice flat but not unfriendly. "Yeah," I replied, pulling out a $20 bill. He didn't take it. "Pump first, then come back inside," he instructed. Something in his tone prompted me to simply nod and turn around. The pump handle was heavier than anticipated, and even through my glove I could feel the cold seeping into my hand. The numbers on the dials ticked over slowly, rattling faintly with each movement. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach clench. My own tire tracks in the snow were already filling in. Not merely lightly dusted, but completely filled, as if hours had passed since I had parked. yet the air was still. Once the tank was full, I re-entered the station. The man was gone. The back door stood wide open, allowing a sharp draft of cold air inside. There were no footsteps now, no sound whatsoever. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding muffled as if my hands were over my ears. I stepped backward, one slow step at a time, and pushed the front door open. My car was still where I had left it, but the pump handle was already rehooked into place. I hadn't done that. I climbed in and started the engine. Out of pure habit, I glanced in the mirror. He was standing across the road 30 feet away, perfectly still, watching me. I never saw him walk there. He was simply present. I didn't think. I just pressed the gas pedal. The road back to the highway felt longer now. The curves seemed incorrect, pulling me in directions I didn't recall. The patches of snow had vanished, replaced by smooth black asphalt that looked wet but did not gleam. When I finally emerged from the trees and reached the highway, I looked back, expecting to see the turnoff. It was gone. I drove for 3 more hours without stopping. And that night, upon checking my map, I discovered something more unsettling than an unmarked station. There was no record of any service station ever existing in that location. Story 2. The path to my remote dwelling had been buried under snowdrifts for several days, meaning I hadn't seen another person since the snowplow passed through the previous week. This level of isolation is not uncommon here. When one chooses to reside on the fringe of a frozen valley in Alaska, they commit to extended periods of absolute solitude. It's not loneliness if you know how to occupy your time. Activities include checking the generator, splitting timber, melting snow for drinking water, tightening fasteners, and mending seams. In this environment, the cold dictates the rhythm of life. Failing to adhere to its schedule incurs a cost. By the 5th night, I had settled into this routine, waking early, maintaining the fireplace, consuming hot meals, and staying productive. The wind usually provided companionship, a constant roar that vibrated the walls and enveloped one in noise. But that night it ceased early without warning. One moment it was present, the next, it was gone. That's when the cabin always felt most vulnerable. You begin to notice sounds you typically don't hear. The shifting of floorboards, the faint ticking of the stove as it cools between logs. I was midway through preparing tea when I heard it. A single, sharp tap on the side of the cabin. It was not muffled, nor was it random. It sounded precisely like someone knocking with their knuckle. I froze, holding the kettle suspended over the stove. I waited for it to recur. Nothing. Perhaps a piece of ice had fallen from the roof and struck the siding, I reasoned. Still, I wished to be certain. I slipped into my boots, retrieved my flashlight from its hook by the door, and stepped onto the porch. The beam illuminated snow that was smooth and pristine, stretching all the way to the tree line. No prints, no broken branches, not even the faint marks left by falling snow clumps. Just an unbroken expanse of white. The cold penetrated my gloves more quickly than anticipated, so I retreated inside, closed the door, and placed the kettle down, steam coiling into the still air. The second tap came before I could pour the water, this time from the opposite wall. My cabin has a simple layout: one main room, a sleeping loft above, and a low crawl space beneath. The only way to traverse from one side of the cabin to the other without leaving external tracks would be through that crawl space. It is small enough that even I must stoop to enter, and the hatch leading into it from the main room is always bolted. I crouched, pressing my ear to the floorboards. At first I thought I had imagined it. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate scrape. It was moving, crawling, heading toward the rear of the house. I directed the flashlight beam toward the hatch. The latch was still in place, but the sound had been close enough that my chest felt constricted. I grabbed the wood stove poker, forcefully pushed the heavy stove across the floor until it completely blocked the hatch, and took 2 steps back. That's when the generator abruptly cut out with a single clean click. The cabin plunged into complete darkness. No hum, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing, too rapid and too loud. I went to the window and cautiously eased the curtain aside just enough to see. The cord connecting the generator to the cabin lay slack in the snow, its plug half buried as if forcibly yanked free. I layered up with a thick coat, gloves, and boots and cracked open the front door. The snow in front of the steps remained pristine, untouched. I closed the door halfway, then decided to inspect the generator anyway. My boots crunched over the frozen crust as I moved around the side toward the back. That's when I saw them. Not human footprints. These were deep, oval impressions spaced far apart. They originated at the tree line and ended directly at the back wall of my cabin. Judging by the distance between them, whatever made them cross that expanse in only 2 or 3 massive bounds. The hatch to the crawl space was hanging open. I saw no drag marks, no exit trail. The surrounding snow was undisturbed save for those 3 peculiar impressions. I didn't even lean down to peer inside. My flashlight beam wavered in my trembling hands as I backed away, each breath loud in my ears. I did not turn my back on the cabin until I reached my truck. Story 3. I commenced my shift at 11 p.m. as always, and by midnight I was the sole person remaining. The manager, Ralph, had completed his customary routine, locking the front doors a brief wave, then exiting the parking area before his car had even warmed up. This left me to organize the shelves and monitor the side entrance for any late arrivals. The reality is, in this part of Alaska, especially during winter, nobody simply drops in at that hour. The streets become deserted after dark. You might encounter a trucker coming off the main road or a fisherman still smelling of the harbor, but most nights there's nothing. You grow accustomed to hearing only the constant hum of the refrigerated units. An hour into my shift, I was arranging frozen meals when I noticed the back storage room door slightly ajar. Not significantly, just enough for the internal darkness to spill into the aisle. I always kept that door shut, not due to policy, but because the place had a peculiar echo. When you spoke in there, the sound returned slightly delayed, as if it had traveled further than the walls should permit. I nudged it closed with my foot and resumed stocking shelves, assuming whoever closed up earlier had simply forgotten. Around 2 a.m., I returned to the register. The screen was illuminated midway through a transaction. An item had been scanned with the total displayed. My mind immediately registered, wait, what? I hadn't processed any sales all night. No one had entered through the side door, or I would have heard the bell. I stared at the list. 2 cartons of milk, a loaf of bread, and 1 item labeled Other. No price, no description, just Other. I cleared the sale, feeling more annoyed than alarmed, assuming I might have leaned on the scanner inadvertently. By 3:10 a.m., I needed to replenish canned goods in aisle 3, so I headed to the back. And indeed, the storage room door was open again. This time, it wasn't just a sliver. It was wide enough for me to see directly down the aisles of boxes. Except the room no longer appeared to be 30 feet deep. It looked longer, as if the walls had somehow receded when I wasn't looking. The air emanating from it was colder than the frigid outside air, which made no sense given that outside temperatures were in the negatives. And there was a faint but sharp smell, like holding pennies in your hand for too long. I pushed my cart inside, its wheels squeaking. The overhead light flickered once, as if contemplating going out. My boots crunched on something thin and brittle scattered across the floor. I bent down and rubbed some between my fingers. It could have been salt or ice crystals. The shelves were not in their accustomed positions. I knew that storage room better than my own living quarters, and I was certain things had shifted just enough to make me doubt myself. I walked to the far wall and placed my hand flat on the cold cinder block. It was solid, just a normal wall. I retrieved the cans I needed and left without looking back. When I reached the front, the receipt printer was uncontrollably printing, unspooling paper into a soft mountain on the counter. Most of it was blank, but near the end, faint outlines of numbers and dates began to appear. Some were from years past, others from years yet to come. By 4 a.m., I decided I was finished with the back room for the remainder of the night. Bread was the final item on my list, after which I planned to pass the time at the counter. The instant I stepped into the storage room, the door swung shut behind me. There was no breeze, no draft, just a clean, soft click as if someone had deliberately closed it. I swept my flashlight beam across the shelves. A stack of boxes I didn't recognize was sitting dead center. On top was a pair of gloves, small, child-sized. The leather was stiff, frosted over as if they had been exposed to the elements for days. I picked them up and the box beneath rattled. Inside was an old receipt from our retail outlet dated 6 years prior. The listed items were things we no longer sold. Tinned coffee, peaches from an unfamiliar brand, fuel tablets. Below the total was a name I didn't recognize. Below that, thick black ink smeared into the word void. The loading bay door groaned open, but instead of revealing the parking lot, it opened onto more shelves, narrower and taller, all curving inward as if burdened by excessive weight. Far back, a single light bulb swung slowly, causing the shadows to swell and recede as if the entire space was breathing. Somewhere within, something was moving. A dragging sound, slow and uneven, as if whatever it was felt no need to rush. I backed up with the bread pallet, never turning my back to the opening until I was out of the room. For the rest of my shift, I remained at the counter by the side door, the bread untouched beside me. When my relief arrived at 7 a.m., he squinted and inquired why the loading bay was open. I told him perhaps the wind had caught it, though I knew the air inside had been perfectly still. Story 4. I had arrived in a small Alaskan town for a short-term contract assignment, and immediately it had that feeling of a place paused in the midst of a struggling decade. Some houses were clearly inhabited with smoke rising from their chimneys, but many had plywood over their windows or siding so badly warped it appeared ready to peel off. If there was a main street, I never saw it. My hotel was 2 blocks from the town's edge, and from my window one could see only flat white landscape and a jagged strip of trees. The work itself was supposedly straightforward. The local Historical Preservation Society had an old cemetery on the outskirts dating back to the late 1800s, and they required a complete catalog before winter truly set in. The instructions were: walk the grounds, record every headstone, photograph each, and note anything unusual for preservation records. They informed me that some of the oldest burials had never been properly documented, so a few surprises were possible. I assumed surprises meant broken markers or faded engravings, not whatever this turned out to be. The caretaker met me at the gate just before dusk. He was an older man, bundled in thick wool layers, leaning heavily on a cane. He was concise, handing me a laminated map and a lantern with a flickering flame, stating he would return at midnight to lock up. Then, almost as an afterthought, he advised, "Stay on the main rows. Don't wander near the tree line, the ground's soft there." He looked at me for a moment too long before turning and shuffling to his truck. The tires crunched away, and then it was just me, the gate, and the cold. The first hour was uneventful. Snow covered almost everything in an even sheet, muffling the sound of my boots. My breath formed short clouds in the air as I moved row to row, brushing frost off stones, transcribing names and dates into my log, and taking quick photos of each. The stones ranged from polished and well-maintained to ones that appeared gnawed by time, leaning crooked, split down the middle with soft and shallow inscriptions. The silence wasn't absolute. There was the faint hiss of the lantern flame and the scrape of my gloves against cold granite. But it was the kind of quiet where every small sound feels amplified. It was perhaps 40 minutes in when I noticed something that didn't fit. 2 graves set apart from the others, much closer to the woods. They were not on the caretaker's map. There were no stone markers either, just rough wooden crosses of similar size stuck into the snow. No names, no flowers, no indications that anyone had tended them in years. They weren't even facing the same direction as the rest of the cemetery. Instead, they faced each other as if intentionally placed that way. I crouched to take a photo and jotted down a note to inquire about them later. The wood looked raw, unpainted, and was splintering at the ends. Definitely not new, but not weathered enough to be decades old either. I turned back toward the main path. That's when I saw the snow behind me. My boot prints were there, deep and well-defined from the packed snow. But inside almost every one of them, perfectly centered, was another footprint. Barefoot, smaller than mine, narrow at the heel. The toes were clearly visible. I stopped breathing for a second. They hadn't been there when I walked past moments earlier. I performed a slow sweep with the lantern. Nothing moved. No tracks leading away. No shapes in the distance. Just the quiet and the cold air biting my nose. I told myself perhaps the prints were older than they looked, possibly frozen in place, uncovered by the wind, and I had simply missed them. I moved to a different section, working faster now. My notes became messier, my photos quicker. 10 minutes later, I glanced over my shoulder again. The same thing had occurred. My boot prints had been filled in, step for step, with those small bare feet. The cold now felt sharper, as if it were settling inside my chest. I started checking behind me more frequently, and each time the trail was there, perfectly matched, perfectly timed. No other prints anywhere. At 11:42 p.m., I decided to cut the night short. I reasoned I could complete the final section tomorrow in daylight. The gate was visible in the distance, the flame in my lantern pulsing as if it were running out of air. Then I saw someone crouched over one of those unmarked graves. I stopped instantly. The snow under my boots crunched so loudly it sounded like breaking glass. The figure straightened. They were not wearing a coat, only thin gray fabric clinging to them as if damp, with bare feet on the snow. Their skin was so pale it seemed to reflect the lantern light. Their arms hung at their sides, fingers held stiff and straight. When the light touched their face, it was like looking through moving water. The nose, mouth, and jaw shifted subtly, never quite staying fixed, but the eyes were sharp, locked onto mine. I stepped back. They stepped forward in perfect synchronicity. The snow under their feet made no sound at all. That was my breaking point. I ran, cutting toward the caretaker's shed instead of the gate. My breath came in jagged bursts that I could hear in my own ears. I didn't look back until I had slammed the bolt across the shed door. The lantern light touched the small, narrow window above the workbench. Through it, I saw them standing exactly where I had left them, head tilted slightly, still watching. 10 minutes later, headlights swept across the cemetery. The caretaker's truck pulled in. I went out to meet him, and the space by the grave was empty. We walked there together, but the 2 wooden crosses were gone. The snow where they had stood was completely smooth, no prints, not even my own. The next morning, I returned to complete my work in daylight. I adhered precisely to the main rows, following the map as if it were scripture. Those graves were not there. I never included them in my report. Story 5. I was 29 years old when I relocated to a small town in Alaska. My cabin was situated at the very edge of the map, beyond the last mailbox, past the final stretch of plowed road. Behind my back door lay nothing but a narrow trail that disappeared into miles of dense forest. Here, silence was more than just an absence of sound. It possessed a texture pressing in on you, making you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. That profound quiet was precisely why I had come. My closest neighbors were two brothers, Cal and Merritt, residing about 100 yards away through a gap in the spruce trees. Their cabin appeared to have been hastily built by hand, then slowly lost its battle against the elements. The roof sagged in the middle as if exhaling, and the siding was so warped it seemed to be peeling away from the frame. I had heard their names before I ever met them, usually at the general store. No one overtly spoke ill of them, but descriptions were always cautious. Keep to themselves, odd hours, don't go knocking. I wasn't the type to pry into anyone's life, but in a town this small you can't help but notice certain patterns. Their lights illuminated at strange times, sometimes all night, other times not at all for days. Packages arrived on the snowmobile mail sled, always wrapped in the same plain brown paper, and they were collected within an hour every single time. I never saw them in town except for brief visits to the supply store, and even then they didn't linger or engage in conversation. If they spoke at all, it was terse, quiet, and only when absolutely necessary. The first time I saw one of them up close was late in February. I was behind my cabin splitting wood. The sun had already set, though it wasn't even 6 p.m. yet. The air was so cold that each strike of the axe resonated sharply in the stillness. I nearly missed the sound of someone approaching behind me. When I turned, Cal was there, standing just at the edge of the trees, hands at his sides, utterly expressionless. He didn't even flinch when I spotted him. I asked if he needed something. He continued staring for a few more seconds before stating, "We were wondering if you'd like to come by sometime." The "we" landed heavily. I didn't need to see Merritt to know he was present, just out of sight among the trees. I told Cal perhaps another time. He didn't nod, didn't speak again, just turned and walked back into the shadows until he was no longer visible. I assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 3 nights later, I awoke to knocking. Not frantic, not particularly loud, just steady and deliberate. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more knocks again. At first, I thought perhaps a branch was brushing the wall in the wind, but the sound was too distinct for that. When I opened the door, the porch was empty. The only sign of activity was a single trail of boot prints leading away from my steps toward the brothers' cabin. It occurred again 2 nights later. This time, I didn't answer. I stood by the side window, holding the curtain just enough to see. Merritt was on my porch, standing still with his head tilted slightly toward the door. He didn't knock again. After a long minute, he stepped down and walked into the trees. Then the other strange occurrences began. One morning, a rusted steel animal trap was leaning against my porch railing, set but empty. I didn't own one, and I certainly hadn't left it there. A few days later, my entire stack of firewood vanished overnight. Not a single wood chip or trail in the snow remained. It was as if the wood had been erased from reality. In early March, I saw them both together for the first time. I was unloading supplies from my truck when I noticed movement at the tree line. Cal and Merritt stood side by side facing my cabin. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply watched. Several minutes passed before Merritt slowly raised his arm and pointed directly at me. Then, in unison, they turned and walked back toward their residence without a word. That night, I remained awake. I kept my rifle across my lap and every light in the cabin burning. Around 2 a.m., my generator cut out without warning. The ensuing silence felt alive. Then came the footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, moving in a circle around the cabin. They stopped near the back wall. The wood creaked just slightly as if someone was leaning against it. I didn't linger to see what would happen next. I grabbed my keys, put on my coat, and slipped out the front. Every step toward the truck felt like a dare I shouldn't take. I didn't look back. I started the engine and drove into town. Story 6. We had been camping in the backcountry of northern Idaho for 3 days, deep enough that you stop contemplating phone signal and simply accept being out of touch. The plan was straightforward: hike in, fish the Clearwater River, and spend a week away from people. The ranger at the Graymore outpost, a lean man with a sunburned nose and no patience for casual conversation, had been emphatic about one thing: all food in the bear canister, locked tightly and kept well away from camp. He stated it not as a mere fact, but as if he had witnessed the consequences of disregarding it. We had adhered to that rule precisely. The canister was locked, stashed a good 30 yards from the tent. I had even checked it the previous night. I cautiously slid out of my sleeping bag, moving slowly to prevent the nylon from crinkling too loudly, and crawled toward the tent door. The brushing sound ceased the moment I approached. Just silence. No movement, no breeze. I whispered Kaylin's name, then Marta's. No answer. I pulled the zipper down a few inches and peered out. The cold instantly struck, sharp, almost metallic, against my teeth. Frost coated the ground in a thin layer, sparkling in the early light. And there, just a few feet from the tent entrance, were tracks. They were not boots, nor were they paw prints. Each mark was long and oval, perhaps slightly wider than my hand, pressed deep at the front and fading toward the back, as if whatever made them had been leaning forward with each step. The strangest part was their configuration. In pairs, too close together, then a gap of several feet, then another pair. Curiosity overcame better judgment. I stepped fully out, my breath puffing in the cold, and followed the tracks. They proceeded directly toward the river, cutting a clean line through the frost. At the bank, they did not stop. They continued directly into the water and emerged on the other side. We ourselves had not crossed that river. The current was too strong, the water bone-chilling and swift. I looked for a fallen log, any stepping stones, nothing. Whatever had crossed had required no assistance. I stood there for a minute, listening to the rush of the river, attempting to devise a normal explanation. Moose? Too small. Bear? Wrong shape. Some kind of bird? Not with that stride length. When I returned to camp, the others were beginning to stir. I recounted what I had seen. Kaylin mumbled something about frost patterns being deceptive, and Marta merely shrugged as if I were overthinking it. I didn't press the issue. We fished that afternoon, working the stretch of river upstream. But every so often I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye, small shifts in the trees across the water. At one point I thought I saw something pale slip between 2 pine trees. By the time I turned to look, the space was empty. That night I disregarded comfort. I kept my boots and jacket on and placed my flashlight next to my sleeping bag. The first half of the night passed without anything unusual. Then, sometime after midnight, a scraping sound pulled me from sleep. At first, I assumed it was a branch dragging across the ground in the wind, but then I heard the hollow thud of something heavy bumping along. I recognized that sound. Our bear canister. I nudged Kaylin awake, placing a finger to my lips. We lay there listening. The sound came in bursts. Scrape, pause, scrape. It wasn't the steady pull of an animal, but more like someone dragging it, stopping every few seconds to adjust their grip. We inched toward the tent door and unzipped it just enough to see out. At the far edge of the clearing, the canister lay on its side. Kneeling next to it was something tall, even in a crouch, with arms that hung low enough to brush the ground. The skin, or whatever I was observing, was pale and smooth, almost featureless in the weak light. It made no sense for something of that size to move so quietly. My eyes had just reached its face when its head turned toward us. The movement was slow, deliberate. I yanked the zipper shut before I could even think about it and scooted back until my spine hit my sleeping bag. We did not sleep after that. For the next hour, it moved around outside the tent. Slow footsteps circled us, but it never pressed against the walls again. As soon as there was sufficient daylight to see without a flashlight, we packed in silence and began the hike out. The trail felt longer on the way back, as if the trees had stretched overnight. Every snapping twig made me jump. By the time we reached the Graymoor outpost, my shoulders ached from gripping my pack straps too tightly. The ranger was behind the counter completing some paperwork. I recounted exactly what we had seen, word for word. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he didn't react immediately, maintaining the same flat expression. Then he said, "You were lucky it didn't follow you." Story 7. I was 23 years old when this occurred, working seasonal maintenance at the Fjordview Anglers Retreat, a remote fishing lodge deep in southern Alaska. By late September, the summer guests had long departed. The float planes had ceased their arrivals and the last of the seasonal crew had flown home. Only I remained to complete the shutdown before the first significant snowfall made departure impossible. The lodge was one of those locations inaccessible by car. In summer, one arrived by boat, in winter by ski plane. We were tucked miles from the nearest road with dense forest on 3 sides and a long stretch of water on the 4th. Once the season concluded, the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy. Every sound, no matter how small, seemed to carry excessively far. There was one other person still present, Mark, a few years my senior, also engaged in seasonal work. We had our own small staff cabins a few hundred yards apart, and typically we adhered to our individual routines, communicating via radio when necessary. My days were repetitive but essential. I would conduct my rounds, checking all 8 guest cabins, ensuring the boathouse was secured, locking the fuel shed, and performing a once-over on the generator shack located on the bluff. Then I would double-check that nothing had been left out that might entice a bear to wander in. It was the kind of work where nothing ever happened, until it did. On my 3rd morning, I noticed something. The lock on cabin 6 was hanging open. This caught my attention because I knew I had locked it the day before. The door would swell when it rained, and I had to push it hard to engage the latch. I stood there for a minute, considering whether I had simply done a poor job or if the wind had dislodged it. Regardless, I locked it again and moved on. The next morning, cabin 6 was worse. The door wasn't just unlatched, it was wide open. Inside, the only item out of place was a single chair, moved into the center of the room and turned toward the window. No other furniture was disturbed, no drawers opened, nothing missing. Just that one chair. I returned it to its place, locked the door, and told myself it was probably Mark playing a trick on me. That night, when Mark came over for coffee, I told him about it. He shook his head, swore he hadn't touched it, and said he'd been by the generator all day replacing a belt. We half-jokingly referred to the cabin 6 ghost, but I observed the way he rubbed the back of his neck as he spoke. 2 mornings later, I found the door closed again, but the chair was sitting outside on the porch facing the tree line. The frost on the ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no drag marks. I simply stood there for a while, staring into the trees, trying to convince myself I was witnessing a prank. By then, I wanted to get to the bottom of it. Mark agreed to accompany me on the rounds the next morning. We started at cabin 1, moving in order. Each one looked exactly as we'd left it until we reached cabin 6. The lock wasn't broken or even damaged, it was simply gone, removed completely. The screws were neatly aligned on the windowsill. Inside, every chair from the cabins we had already checked that morning was arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the floor. 8 chairs total, none from cabin 6. We didn't touch them. We stepped out, closed the door, and walked back without much conversation. That afternoon, we kept busy inside the main lodge, performing minor repairs and organizing gear. We attempted a game of cards later, but both of us kept glancing toward the windows. Around 9 p.m., the generator cut out. This was problematic, as without it, the heat would rapidly diminish. We grabbed our flashlights and headed for the bluff. About halfway there, both beams caught movement off to the side, something human-shaped slipping between the trees without a sound. We both froze. I called out, "Hey!" Nothing. When we reached the generator shed, the access hatch was wide open. Every single tool from the workbench had been removed and placed in a straight line leading into the woods. The line extended beyond what our lights could reach. We didn't follow it. We closed the hatch, left the tools where they were, and walked back to the lodge without speaking. That night, the knocking began. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more, always from a different wall, moving around us in a slow circle. We sat there, silent, just listening. When daylight finally arrived, we opened the lodge's main door and found all 8 chairs from the cabin stacked in a tall, unstable tower directly in front of the entrance. The structure swayed in the breeze but did not fall. We didn't wait for a third night. We radioed for pickup. The pilot arrived that afternoon, asked not a single question, simply loaded us up and got us out. Story 8. We were a solid week into an extended summer road trip through Alaska. That day, we had departed Gull's Landing, a tiny coastal fishing town. We had been driving since early morning. After nearly 8 hours, the highway had narrowed into a lonely strip of asphalt between 2 ridges, and the scenery had begun to repeat itself. Miles of rock and scrub, then more rock and scrub, like a looping background in an old animated film. The air inside the car had grown somewhat stale from the hours. I had been idly flipping through the binder of printed directions we had brought along for amusement, which until then had been merely a quaint road trip novelty. But since our phones had lost signal hours ago, no bars, no maps, it had transformed from a novelty into our actual lifeline. I kept checking for signal anyway, as if the mountains might suddenly part and grant us a single perfect cell tower. It had been at least 40 minutes since we had passed another car. The road was so quiet you almost forgot it was a highway. I was just contemplating the strangeness of being in such a vast place with so few people when I noticed Lorian's hands tighten on the steering wheel, as if bracing herself. Up ahead, parked on the gravel shoulder, was a dull green SUV. Its hood was open and a man was standing beside it. From a distance, I thought he might be waving us down. One arm was raised, but it wasn't frantic, just a slow, steady motion. Lauren eased her foot off the gas. As we rolled closer, the full picture became clear. The SUV wasn't just old. It looked as though it had endured something. The rear window wasn't cleanly missing. It was shattered, the kind of break where jagged shards of glass still clung to the frame, catching the light in uneven slivers. The man was dressed inappropriately for the weather. It was mild outside, warm enough that I had been wishing for more airflow. But he was in a heavy, dark coat and thick pants. No gloves, no hat. The coat hung open, swinging slightly, and I saw no indication he had been working on the car. No tools, no grease on his hands, no crouching to inspect the tires. We slowed to a crawl, and that's when it truly became strange. Instead of remaining near the hood like someone genuinely dealing with a breakdown, he walked toward us, not in a hurry, just steady steps toward the driver's side window. Lauren's knuckles had turned pale on the steering wheel. He leaned in, not close enough to be right at the glass, but near enough that I tensed without thinking, and said in a calm, almost casual tone, "Do you want me to ride with you just until the next town?" That was it. No. No, could you call for help? No, hey, my phone's dead, can I use yours? Just a direct request to enter our car. I shook my head and told him no. I said we would call roadside assistance once we had service. He didn't object. He didn't even seem surprised. He just stared at me, not a glare, just a fixed, unblinking look, long enough that I found myself silently counting. By the time I reached 5, Lorian had pressed the gas pedal again. As the car began to inch forward, he stepped back, but not toward his SUV. He walked behind us slowly, turning his head just enough to keep his eyes on the rear of the car, as if ensuring he memorized it. I kept him in the side mirror until the curve of the road finally obscured him from view. We drove in silence for a while after that. My pulse was still uneven, but I told myself he might have just been an awkward guy with a broken window and no idea how to ask for help. People can be strange, especially in the middle of nowhere. 20 minutes later, the ridges receded and we reached a long, gentle bend in the highway. I was looking out at the stretch ahead when my stomach flipped. A dull green SUV in the exact same spot on the shoulder, hood up. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe there had been a side road we hadn't noticed. Maybe he had somehow gotten ahead of us. But there hadn't been a single turnoff, just a straight, uninterrupted stretch of road. And then I saw him. Same coat, same stance, same slow stillness, as if he had been waiting. Lorian's hands gripped the wheel even tighter. "That's not..." she began, then cut herself off. We didn't slow down. His head turned as we passed, eyes following us the entire way until we were gone. Neither of us spoke for the next hour. The daylight no longer felt as bright. It wasn't until 2 hours later that we finally saw signs of civilization. A squat little Arctic waypoint, a fuel station with a flickering sign, sitting like an outpost at the edge of nothing. We pulled in without even discussing it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old coffee and motor oil. The man at the counter was older, wearing a faded ball cap. I told him as casually as I could manage what we had seen. He looked at me for a moment, then at the trucker leaning on the counter beside him. Finally, he said, "Ain't nobody stranded on that road. Closest thing out there is the old mining road, 50 miles in. Been closed for decades, doesn't go anywhere." We topped off the tank, grabbed a couple of candy bars for the road, and silently agreed we would take the longer highway directly to Anchorage. Story 9. The path was marked on my map as an easy half-day loop, the kind of route people with young children and granola bars would undertake on a Sunday afternoon. In the summer, it also served as a berry-picking location, which made me consider it as harmless as possible. I had been in Alaska for about 2 months at that point, moving between seasonal jobs, anything that would cover rent and groceries and perhaps offer me an opportunity to see more than the interior of a gift shop. Hiking alone had become a form of therapy for me. It was the only quiet I experienced between sleeping in crowded bunkhouses and being surrounded by tourists who wanted to know if the moose were appearing on schedule. The loop began from a gravel pull-off that could be easily missed if you weren't aware of its presence. From there, the trail cut through birch and spruce trees before ascending to a ridge where supposedly one would gain a broad view of the river. I expected to be back in time for dinner. The first mile was textbook pleasant. Dry dirt under my boots, sun breaking through the branches, a couple of chickadees flitting across the path. I passed 2 people heading out just as I started, a man and a woman, each with a bucket of berries, conversing in a way that suggested they had been mid-sentence for hours. I offered them a quick smile and continued. Once they had rounded the bend, the woods simply swallowed every other sound. 2 miles in, the ground began to dip. The trees crowded in, and their branches knitted together overhead until the strip of sky was so narrow it barely qualified. The undergrowth thickened enough to brush my knees with every step. I stopped to drink water, and that's when I noticed it. The trail markers were different. At the beginning, the markers had been old orange plastic, faded and chipped, nailed high up every 100 feet or so. Here they were bright, glossy, even new enough that they almost caught the light, and they were spaced closely together. as if the person who placed them had been paid per nail. I told myself it was just a different maintenance section, perhaps a newer part of the loop. But the thought didn't exactly settle comfortably. I continued walking, but something had shifted. No wind now, no mosquito buzzing. Even my own steps sounded strange, as if I were walking on packed felt instead of dirt. I rounded a slight bend and realized my direction was incorrect. According to my map, I should have been heading west toward the ridge overlook. My compass indicated north. I pulled out my phone to check GPS, but it simply sat there, spinning as if buffering a video from 2006. That was my signal to turn back. I decided I would retrace my steps and try again another day. But about 10 minutes into my return, I walked past a massive boulder split perfectly down the middle. I knew I had seen it before on my way in, which meant I had somehow looped back in the wrong direction without realizing it. I stopped and did a slow 360-degree scan. The trail stretched out in every direction, as if daring me to choose incorrectly. Nothing looked familiar enough to commit to. And that's when I saw them. About 40 feet ahead, standing dead center where the trail squeezed between two tall pine trees. Tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket zipped up to their chin. They were not moving. They weren't even shifting their weight. I slowed down, waiting for them to step aside, but they didn't. I gave a small, awkward wave, the kind you offer a neighbor you're unsure actually recognizes you. Nothing. My first thought was to call out, perhaps ask if they knew the way back, but something about their stillness made my throat feel constricted. They weren't curious, they weren't acknowledging me, they were just there. I decided I would step off the trail and go around. I moved into the undergrowth a bit, keeping them in my peripheral vision, but when I looked back, they were gone. No footsteps moving away, no rustling branches, just an empty trail. I told myself they had probably ducked away themselves, perhaps to avoid me. That suited me fine. I walked faster, focusing on finding a junction or landmark. But the orange markers were gone. In their place were these pale blue strips of fabric tied to branches, frayed, faded, hanging limp. They weren't evenly spaced, and a few were tied far off to the side as if leading somewhere else entirely. And then, in the same spot on the trail, the same distance ahead, they were back. This time, they were facing me. I didn't even think about it. I simply turned sharply left and pushed into the trees. Branches slapped my arms, snagged my pack straps, caught in my hair. The ground dropped and I used the slope, half running, half sliding. Somewhere ahead I heard water, a low rushing sound, and aimed directly for it. The slope deposited me onto a narrow strip of gravel by the river. The water was swift but shallow enough to follow the bank. I kept the current on my left and moved quickly, forcing myself not to look back too often. Each time I did, the tree line looked the same. Dark, dense, inscrutable. Eventually, the steel frame of a bridge came into view. On the far side, I could see the gravel pull-off where I had parked. I didn't slow down until my hand was on my car door. I glanced back toward the trailhead. From here, the opening in the trees looked small, almost hidden, as if it had been waiting for me to step back in. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove away. I never took that trail again, and I've never hiked alone since.